Alrighty. So to get started, we are pleased to invite Kathleen Martin to discuss sea turtles this evening with us. Kathleen Martin is the founding member and executive director of the Canadian Sea Turtle Network. She is interested in sea turtles and how communication affects conservation, as well as the link between conservation and economic development. She holds a degree in English literature from the University of Toronto and the Queen's University. Kathleen has been an adjunct professor in Dalhousie University's School for Resource and Environmental Studies and was a lecturer in the Fred C. Manning School of Business at Acadia University. She is an award-winning journalist and the author of Kamikwai, Finding Peace, Love, and Injustice in Sierra Leone, as well as of 7 nature books for children, including Sturdy Turtles and Floating Jellyfish. Thank you so much, Kathleen, for being here. We're super excited to learn from you in your presentation this evening. The floor is yours, Kathleen.
Thank you. Sorry, I
I
was
think
muted.
you.
Better now. I'm so happy to be here. I'm so excited that so many people have decided to come in, listen to some information about sea turtles and sea turtles in the Canadian context during what is Oceans Week, basically. Oceans Day is on Saturday, so it's really great timing. We just finished World Sea Turtle Day, or World Turtle Day. I think World Sea Turtle Day is coming up. Anyway, it's hard to keep them all straight, but I'm really honored to be here and excited to talk to you. I do have a presentation, which I'll go through, and we can chat and have some questions afterwards if people are comfortable with that. Yeah, I'll just launch into that. I'm going to talk with you about mostly leatherback sea turtles and a little bit also about some hard-shelled sea turtles too. You guys see the screen okay? Okay, awesome. So as Marina mentioned, I'm the executive director and one of the founders of the Canadian Sea Turtle Network, and we work to conserve endangered sea turtles in Canadian waters and worldwide. And we are based out of Halifax. I'm going to talk, as I said, mostly about leatherback sea turtles tonight. They're the turtles that we've studied the most off of Atlantic Canada. This is one of my very favorite pictures of a leatherback sea turtle. They are an endangered species. Every species of sea turtle, there are 7, is endangered globally, and leatherbacks are no exception. They're on the Species at Risk Act. They're protected under the Species at Risk Act in Canada, as well as through different acts around the world. And this is one of my very favorite pictures of a leatherback. And I like it because it shows you everything that makes a leatherback. So you can see they have really long front flippers, about the length of at least half their body. That's unusual in sea turtles. They don't usually have flippers that long. Leatherbacks are in a family all of their own. So they're different from the hard-shelled sea turtles that you would normally expect to see, that often people will have had experience seeing on vacations. If they go swimming with sea turtles, it's not with leatherbacks. It would be with the hard-shelled sea turtles, usually green turtles. So leatherbacks are in a scientific family all their own. They have a shell that is made not up of kind of the typical turtle shell scales or scutes. Instead, their carapace, or their top shell, is a matrix of little tiny bones that are all matched together, almost like a really beautiful mosaic or a jigsaw puzzle. Some people like to think of it as a jigsaw puzzle, that's buried in fat and in cartilage, and then covered in a layer of skin that is typically kind of inky blue in color. When we see them up north, they almost have that green cast, largely, as you can see in this image, because of the diatoms, the algae and things that grow on their shell while they're up here. They have 7 long ridges that run the length of their shell, and you can see that really beautifully here. Those enormous rear flippers, and as well, you can see a pink spot on the top of their head. And I'm just going to show you, I'm hoping this works. This is, yeah, it does, good. It is video footage that we shot off of northern Cape Breton of a leatherback turtle swimming. And I like this for a number of reasons. You get a better idea of that kind of algae growth on the carapace of the sea turtle. You can see how barrel shaped they are when they swim, and also how elegantly they swim. They really remind me of a flying bird. They can dive really deeply. Leatherbacks can dive deeper than 1 kilometer into the ocean. They can hold their breath for more than an hour. This turtle, if you look carefully, has a streaming jellyfish coming out of its mouth. It's just popping its head above the surface of the water to breathe, but you can sort of see the jelly there. I mentioned the pink spot on the top of their head. Every leatherback has one. Sometimes they're pink, sometimes they're kind of white, sometimes they're orange, but they're within that pink realm. So they're referred to as a pink spot. Some of them are really small, some of them are big. People like to compare them to a fingerprint in that each one is individual for the turtles. The interesting thing about them is first of all, they're the lightest spot on a really dark bodied animal, an otherwise dark bodied animal. And so and it covers, it's also at the thinnest part of the skull. And so it covers something called a pineal gland. And the pineal gland in other animals, particularly things like birds, is used for navigational purposes. So there's no one knows exactly what the pink spot is there for. No scientist has been able to establish that with certainty, but there is a working hypothesis, a kind of widely accepted working hypothesis that the trajectory of the light as it enters that pink or lighter spot on the turtle's head and hits the pineal gland somehow helps the turtle understand where it is, helps it geolocate, helps it understand where it is in the water. As I mentioned earlier, leatherbacks are incredible divers. They can dive deeper than a kilometer, hold their breath for longer than an hour, and that's just on animals that we've had some kind of tracking device on. So there's likely a larger range that exists there as well. But it's amazing to see how effortlessly they dive. And that's part of what's so interesting about that carapace that I was talking about earlier. It's made up of those teeny tiny bones. And if you imagine it like a jigsaw puzzle in terms of how it's put together, you can think about the flexibility of something like a jigsaw puzzle if you're trying to move it from a table to something else, right? It doesn't stay firm, it moves, or doesn't stay solid, it moves and flexes. And the same thing happens with a leatherback shell, kind of on this very simplified way of explaining it, but on a broader scale, which gives them flexibility, right, in terms of the shape of their carapace, and which is different from a hard shell turtle, for example, right? If you think of a turtle or a tortoise, or even a freshwater turtle that you would find for the most part, the hard shelled ones, they don't have that same kind of flexibility of structure. And so physiologically, this allows a leatherback to dive a lot deeper in the ocean than other turtles can dive, and then a lot of other things can dive. And it allows them the flexibility that keeps them from basically imploding or exploding, depending on what's going on. This is a really lovely slide. This was created by Sherman Bleakney, who used to be the head of the biology department at Acadia, Dr. Bleakney. And he's amazing. He's contributed. I'm sure anybody that's been kind of in the naturalist community for a long time in Nova Scotia will know his name. He was one of the things that he was passionate about, in addition to leatherback turtles, was anatomy of turtles. And thanks to him, we know an awful lot about the anatomy of leatherbacks. And this is a slide that he had prepared, and these are skeletons that he was working with, and it shows that obviously the relative size of an adult human arm and hand to the flipper size of a leatherback. And the size part is one thing, but really the thing that Sherman loved about this slide, and that I really love about this slide, is that he was able to discern that the bone structure of the leatherback's flippers and kind of what we would call a wrist joint mirrors precisely the bone structure and number and the placement of the bones that we have in our hand and our wrist, which is really interesting from an evolutionary standpoint. And also, I was just in Trinidad. We do an eco tour to Trinidad every year, a couple of eco tours. And one of the ones I was leading just a couple of weeks ago, had a physician on it, and she said, "Oh my goodness, I have always thought it was so silly how our wrists are put together. It doesn't make any sense, kind of in terms, it's so complex, right? Such a complex structure." And she said, "This helps me make a lot more sense out of it." Anyway, obviously leatherbacks have flat joints where our ball joints are for knuckles and fingers, but it's a really cool thing about leatherbacks. They grow to be enormously big. They're the largest. Well, there's an argument about leatherbacks and saltwater crocodiles, which one's bigger, but they're one of the largest reptiles in the world. The ones that we see off the coast of Atlantic Canada are routinely about 1,000 pounds. This just gives you an idea, as well as they're both long and also tall. And you can get a sense of that kind of barrel shape. These are the scientist on the right, Dr. Mike James, who's works at Fisheries and Oceans Canada, is 6 feet tall. So you can get a sense in relation to this turtle. And then what I think is so interesting is they're enormously big, and then they're even bigger sometimes. This is the biggest turtle we ever worked with. Its carapace. So when you measure turtles or sea turtles, you measure their curved carapace length. Not all of them, but always leatherbacks, over the curve of their carapace. Sometimes people will do a straight carapace length with smaller turtles, but you have to be able to leatherbacks are just too big to do that. We couldn't, you'd have to carry just the most enormous pair of calipers to be able to do it for leatherbacks. Is not even practical. So we do curved carapace length globally when we're measuring them. And this one was 176 centimeters across its curved carapace length, which is enormously big. When leatherbacks start their lives, they start them on nesting beaches. The ones that we see in Atlantic Canada, so part of the Northwest Atlantic population of leatherbacks, start their lives in South and Central America, the north part of South America, and sometimes as far north as Florida. They have nesting beaches. We don't ever have sea turtles nesting in Canada. If sea turtles in Canada are found on shore, they are in trouble. They're either dying or dead. So if you ever see a sea turtle on shore, it's a big deal. They nest only in the tropics. And so this is actually French Guiana, and this is a leatherback. This is a great picture of a leatherback because you can see her so clearly. You get that beautiful inky blue skin. What we see on the turtles that are nesting turtles is often these white polka dots like you see. She's such a beautiful example of a leatherback here. We don't tend to see the polka dots expressed so much when they're up north. And I don't know if that has something to do with what goes on when they're nesting. When they're nesting, you'll also see they're very flush. They get a lot of pink underneath their throats. So it kind of, again, we're not really sure what the situation is there. Well, we see turtles that are the same turtles up north, and they don't have that similar, they have sort of some spots, but certainly not to this degree. We would be very rarely would we see that. Anyway, she's nesting. Typically, leatherbacks nest at night. And so the nesting process takes about 2 hours. So sometimes they'll haul up during the day. They don't often nest during the day, but a lot of times they'll start nesting in the middle of the night, say around, it'll be dark around 3:30 or 4 in the morning. And then by the time they're done nesting, it's a 2-hour process. The sun is up and you can get some really lovely pictures. 60 days later, so leatherbacks lay there, they nest, they carve a big, deep chamber in the sand, and they lay approximately 100 eggs, between 80 and 120 eggs each time they nest. So when the leatherbacks don't nest every year. So they'll nest every 2 to 3 years, approximately, depending. Again, there's always variation. There's always a spectrum of how they behave, but typically every 2 to 3 years. And then the year that's a nesting year, in the Atlantic, they'll nest between about 6 and 10 times, depending on the turtle. So they'll come lay a clutch of eggs, and then they'll return to the ocean for between 10 and 12 days, and then they'll come back and lay another clutch of eggs, and then they'll go back again, and they'll do this, like I said, on average 8 times. They lay the eggs, they cover them up, and they return to the ocean, and they don't offer maternal care to those eggs. The eggs will hatch about 60 days later, and you'll see little tiny hatchling leatherbacks, and they are so cute. And one of the neat things about leatherback hatchlings is they look basically just like they do when they're an adult. Often with little babies, you'll see the kind of a differentiation between the juvenile of a species and then the larger species. Leatherbacks is just a smaller version of an adult, basically. And they are really tiny. They'll fit in the palm of your hand. And they hatch, and they head to the brightest spot on the horizon, which is typically the ocean, and they return to the ocean, which means that you don't ever see male leatherbacks back on the beach again. So the hatchling leatherbacks head into the ocean. We don't know what happens to them until they're about 120 centimeters carapace length, curved carapace length. We don't see them. They're called the lost years. With leatherbacks, we do know where they go with other species of sea turtle. Hard-shelled sea turtle is easier to put a transmitter on those shells. It's really hard to attach them to little baby leatherbacks. And they disappear, and we don't see them again until they're really big. Anyway, they are extremely charming. They are at risk when they're crossing the nesting beach from natural predation. That's kind of the time they're most at risk from natural predation. Then they head into the water. You'll never see a male leatherback on the nest again that's healthy and alive, as I said before. You'll never see a little smaller. You only see the mature females, so the nesting females will return to beaches. And what's interesting about sea turtles generally, and leatherbacks as well, is that they exhibit fidelity to where they nest. So nesting beach fidelity. So if I've hatched on a beach in a particular area of the world, I will return typically to that beach or a beach near it to lay my eggs. So what you see on those beaches when you've got the nesting females are daughters and mothers and sisters and aunts, all spread out across those beaches. It makes really interesting. They do a lot of matrilineal DNA work on leatherbacks to kind of figure out where they come from. And they can do that because it tends to be the females of a family that are returning to areas of a beach. Certain species of sea turtle like loggerheads will return almost to the meter to where they hatched. Like they'll come back. They tend to be extremely, not every single time, but they can be like faithful to a huge degree to where they have hatched or where they nested last time. Leatherbacks are more regionally faithful. You'll see them across, a region like around Trinidad. Maybe they might do Venezuela, maybe they might do French Guiana, but typically if they're a nester from Trinidad, they'll return to Trinidad. And then when they're bigger is when we see them. So this is a Matura Beach in Trinidad, which is a place where there's a lot of, it's the last most important nesting beach remaining for leatherback turtles in the Atlantic Ocean. And this is northern Cape Breton. And so the question always is like, why are they up here? It doesn't make any sense. And for a really long time, no one believed that leatherbacks came to Canadian waters on purpose. They felt that any turtles that were here were extraliminal, so beyond the limits of their typical migratory pattern. Here by mistake, which is, or lost, some people say. And I love when they talk about lost because it's, of course, such a human construct. No animal is lost. Humans get lost, animals don't get lost. Anyway, the person, this is Sherman Bleakney again, the person I was mentioning who did that anatomy slide. Here he is in the middle of this slide next to his family of Volvo. And he was super interested in the leatherbacks that he was hearing wash up dead or be found entangled in fishing gear by fishermen along the south shore of Nova Scotia. And back in the early 60s, was really intrigued by this idea and thought, what is going on with these animals? This is weird, and was very interested in studying them. So he would ask the fishermen who brought in these animals or found them dead at sea, would they call him? And he would collect the carcasses and he would drive them up into the Annapolis Valley to a friend's farm where he would conduct full-scale necropsies on these animals. And what he discovered was he would open up their esophagus or their intestinal tract, and they'd look in their stomachs and look at what they ate and try and understand what was going on with them. And what he determined was that they were coming up to Canadian waters to feed on jellyfish, and that they were here on purpose, and that this was a directed swim for them, because he found on a couple of occasions little twigs from mangrove trees of a specific, he found the species of mangrove, and it was in the tropics, and he said it wasn't digested, it was still, relatively fresh, and he said they must have been recently in the tropics. And so it was his idea that they came up here to feed on jellyfish. And the scientists of the day found that hilarious. I mean, they just were not buying what Sherman was selling on that fact. And he wrote a really seminal paper about the occurrence of leatherback turtles in Atlantic Canada, and then just couldn't get any funding. Nobody wanted to fund him because they thought he was out to lunch. And so Sherman, being Sherman, reinvented himself. He became a global expert on the sea slug, had the most curious mind, keen intellect, really just an amazing human being. And he's one of my favorite stories because he kept up his interest. Like he kept just collecting information on sea turtles as he could manage it, with whatever funding he could scrape together, and really helped found our understanding of leatherback turtles in how they use the Atlantic. And so one of the key things he did was he worked with members of the fishing community. And so we started to hear from when Mike James came to do, who's the other founder of the Sea Turtle Network, came to do graduate work at Acadia, we were starting to hear more and more about leatherback turtles washing up dead. There just happened to be a number of them that Dr. Chris Harvey Clark, who was working was the head veterinarian at Dalhousie at the time, was noticing. And he kind of said to Mike at one point, if you love turtles so much, if you're interested, you should have a look and see what's going on. Why don't you pick up on Sherman Bleakney's work to see if this is something that that might be of interest. I was working in communications at the time and got involved early on, helping do things like create posters and newsletters and things to kind of try and raise the awareness that we're curious about whether or not these sea turtles were here. And so went to the fishing villages based on what Sherman had done. And I will say one of the happiest, really proudest moments of my work was when we got Sherman Bleakney on a fishing boat in Nova Scotia to show him a leatherback turtle at sea, because of course everything he had predicted was right. Everything he had hypothesized, we proved was accurate. And he's a wonderful story because it reminds me of how the truth always percolates. It always comes out ultimately. And if people aren't ready to hear what you have to say, but it is true, it will eventually come to light, and he really was able to trust in that process. Anyway, it's notable that he is wearing in this picture, which I love so much, a giant sea slug sweatshirt, which I appreciate very much. He was representing the sea slugs even on the sea turtle boat. But it was really magnificent to be able to watch him see the first sea turtle at sea that he'd ever seen. It was really, he was in his 80s when he came with us. It was really, really, really special. The other person that was working on the early days with us was Dr. Tom Herman, who's also one of our, the pillars of our turtle world, the herpetological world in Canada, and certainly Atlantic Canada. He was also an Acadia professor, and he had been doing a lot of work with landing sea turtles, and allowed us to steal his idea of have you seen this turtle posters. Many of you probably are familiar with this from the landings studies that take place at KEGI, the amazing studies and amazing program that is. And so we put posters up along the coast of Nova Scotia, every fishing wharf we could find, to ask fishermen if they'd ever seen leatherbacks. These are a couple of versions of the posters over the years. And then it was amazing. So until, at this point, Mike was doing most of it on his own until that first summer when he started asking fishermen, do you ever see these turtles? Because, we're seeing some of them are washing up dead, and people say that they don't come here, and scientists think that anything that's here is here by mistake. Is there any truth to this? And the fishermen just were like, oh, they're so wrong. And there's a few things that you can throw at a fisherman in Atlantic Canada that is more intriguing to them than than proving science wrong, with things that they know and that they've learned just from their work, right? Their traditional ecological knowledge. And so there had until that point been 70 extant records of leatherback sea turtles in the history of Atlantic Canada, just 7 in the kind of traditional written Western scientific history of Atlantic Canada. And in one summer, we had 171 sightings of leatherback turtles called into us by fishermen across the region. In one summer, because those fishermen decided to take a moment and write down the latitude and longitude of the turtles they saw. We had the early days, this was back in 1998. In the early days, they had Fuji Camera had been one of our first donors, and they gave us these reusable, I don't know if you remember those, they're like environmentally horrific, but at the time didn't seem to be, those single-use plastic underwater cameras. And so we would give them to the fishermen and say, if you can take a picture of the turtles, if you see them, we'd love, more evidence of them. And they took pictures, and they helped in one summer. All of those people helped rewrite the global history of a dinosaur. Leatherbacks have been on Earth for more than 150 million years. When T-Rex was on the land, leatherbacks were in the water. And so, I love that story too. It speaks to the generosity of the fishing communities, the coastal communities in Nova Scotia and throughout Atlantic Canada. And it also, to me, really speaks to, I spend a lot of time talking to young people, and it's a crazy world we have right now. And it's a really hard place for people to understand how to manage, politically, environmentally, everything. It's a lot for people. And one of the things I always cling to is this beautiful story of the fishing communities in Nova Scotia. And like I said, throughout Atlantic Canada. At the beginning, it was largely just Nova Scotia. Is that the fishermen did the thing that was in front of them. It wasn't like they were like waking up and thinking they wanted to become these incredible herpetologists who were going to change the world, marine biologists, and they were going to figure out the new part, like extend our understanding of the life history of this 150 million year old species. They weren't trying to do this giant thing that they did. They were simply trying to help in whatever way that was available to them. And I always think that's such a beautiful, instructive story about the idea of how, combined and in aggregate, we make huge change, even if it just looks like a small thing that we're doing. Anyway, they were able to help establish the fact that, and we continued to work very, very closely with commercial fishermen and establish the fact that leatherback turtles were indeed coming to Canadian waters. In fact, what we've been able to prove over the last 25 years is that Canadian waters are arguably the most important foraging ground for these animals in the Western Atlantic. One of the ways we could, once we established that sea turtles were here, we wanted to understand what they were doing, right? So where did they go? This idea existed for a long time too, that if they were coming to Canada, then they must be coming up along the Gulf Stream. There must be this migratory corridor that they were using to get here, which would have been great because it would have been easier to protect a migratory corridor, but ended up being not accurate in terms of how leatherbacks use the ocean, which I'll show you in a minute. But anyway, so we started satellite tagging leatherback turtles using fishermen as the captains of our field boats, as our research partners, as scientific research assistants. All of this work that was done, we ended up being the first people. This is what the fishing boat catching a turtle looks like. One of the you know, we were the first group in the world to ever figure out how to satellite tag a leatherback turtle at sea. Other people had never been able to figure it out. And the reason we could do it was because we were working with the fishing community and members of the fishing community, and they understand how to work with large animals in the ocean and how to find large animals, large endangered animals in a very vast ocean. And so it was because of the fishermen of our region that we were able to really advance the science of leatherback sea turtles. And if you recall what I was talking about on the nesting beach, you know, our understanding until this kind of thing, we were able to crack the code on how to work with leatherbacks at sea. All of the science was done on nesting female turtles or on hatchling turtles. So there was no science that was being done on subadult turtles, so or male turtles, right? And so all of that work that was first done on those animals was done by the Canadian project. All of that kind of that big question mark about what was happening with those other parts of this endangered population came from the Canadian project, and because of this great relationship that we have with commercial fishermen. So it's basically, you know, catching a dinosaur with a butterfly net, which is pretty neat. This is leatherback eating a giant jellyfish after it's been satellite tagged. One of my favorite pictures because it shows how unbothered they are by the tags. A feeding animal is a happy animal, and that turtle hopped off the boat and came right back up with the jellyfish. So that was really great. This is one of the first tracks of ever showing a return migration for a leatherback sea turtle, tagged off of Atlantic Canada, went down all the way down through South America, up past Trinidad and up back to Atlantic Canada again. That's an annual migration that they make, enormously long. The widest ranging reptile in the world is leatherback sea turtle. And then this is my other favorite slide. So we had that thought at the beginning, maybe the leatherbacks use a migratory corridor, but actually, as you can see here, this is about 161 satellite tagged sea turtles over the years. And they use the whole Western Atlantic, most of the Atlantic Ocean, you know, and so they pose a really interesting challenge when it comes to conservation, because you can't do something like wall off the part of the ocean that they're in and protect it in ways that are helpful to other species. Leatherbacks just range too far, and that's a really big deal. They're coming up to Canadian waters, as Sherman had hypothesized, to feed on jellyfish, usually our lion's mane jellyfish, as well as moon jellyfish. Those little clear, the lion's manes are the big red ones, as probably most of you all know, and the moon jellyfish are the little smaller clear ones, which they eat in enormous amounts. You can see there's another picture of a leatherback. We get really big lion's mane jellyfish off the coast of Nova Scotia, like the size of trash can lids up off northern Cape Breton in the late summer. And so turtles are munching on. We routinely get calls in the fall. I saw a turtle with a rope hanging out of its mouth and it's bleeding, you know, and in reality, it's just a giant tentacle from a lion's mane jellyfish. Leatherbacks don't have teeth like all turtles. They don't have teeth. What they have instead is their esophagus and their stomach are lined with spines, cartilaginous spines that are extremely sharp, and that shred the jellyfish all the way down. That's just a segment of the spines. They're so sharp we can't use. You can use just surgical gloves to do a necropsy on leatherbacks, on every other part of a leatherback turtle, but on the esophageal spines, you have to be wearing dish gloves because they're so sharp, they'll slice right through the other gloves. And they shred the jellyfish on their way down. This is a leatherback's underwater feeding. And we wanted to have an idea of, you know, we knew that they were eating jellyfish, but what nobody understood was how much did they need to eat? You know, how much are they eating? How are they eating? Because the weird thing was we'd see these leatherbacks come up, you know, by the boat with these huge jellyfish in their mouth, but we weren't seeing jellyfish at the surface of the water. And when we were talking to fishermen, they talk about jellyfish kind of getting wrapped up in their gear, but they wouldn't like on the lines and stuff, but you wouldn't be seeing, like, we were forever recording presence or absence of jellyfish, and you just didn't see them very often. And so we wanted to understand, like, how many jellyfish were leatherbacks eating. And so they created an underwater video camera, very early days of the critter cam, before it was kind of routinely done. And we're able to get some footage. This is footage that I really love of a leatherback. So this is a pink spot on the top of the leatherback's head. We're looking over the leatherback's head right now. And you can see the little pink spot there. I don't know if you can see on my screen this, but it's right there. And the leatherback's eating jellyfish. So this is what it looks like underwater. And there's another jellyfish already. Look. It reminds me of Pac-Man, this thing. I love this video so much. It's doing its chewing. And leatherbacks, in 150 million years never evolved. They evolved the ability to eat jellyfish, right? They're not bothered by jellyfish at all. But one thing they've never evolved is the ability to go backwards. They cannot swim in reverse, which is a problem for them when it comes to becoming entangled in things. But it's also a really interesting conundrum when they see jellyfish that they want to eat and they want to make sure they don't get past it. So you can see at the bottom of the screen another jellyfish coming in. And this turtle's still eating this big one. And I love how fast he starts to chew. He just starts to chew and chew and chew really quickly. It's so charming, trying to figure out how he can finish before this other jellyfish goes by him. And what we were able to understand is that leatherbacks, by looking at hours and hours and hours of this video, is that leatherbacks eat approximately their body weight in jellyfish every day. So in the oceans off of Atlantic Canada, these animals are consuming per day, each turtle, about 1,000 pounds of jellyfish. They're sucking that out of the ecosystem here. And that's a really interesting place to occupy in a food web, right? Because not a lot of things eat jellyfish. Mola mola eat jellyfish and leatherbacks eat jellyfish. And mola mola is a big, amazing ocean sunfish. Eat jellies, and so do leatherbacks. But the thing about jellyfish is they feed on larval fish. They're carnivorous, and they feed on larval fish and on roe, like on fish eggs, among other things. And so they have a jellyfish heavy ecosystem is really difficult from a fishery standpoint. So if we're looking at Atlantic Canada and you're thinking of kind of the economic spin-off of things, leatherbacks are helping to control the jellyfish population in a major way here, which helps protect fisheries. This is a Canadian leatherback turtle. This is on the beach, a nesting beach in French Guiana. And if you look at her, you can really see those ridges, that medial ridge, the big long ridge that runs along the middle of her carapace is there, and really prominent. And this is the same turtle a few months later. So this is a picture that was taken in March. And this one is taken 4.5 months later, end of July, off of Nova Scotia. Leatherbacks eat 33, they gain 33% more body weight when they're in Atlantic Canada. And this is also the miracle of that incredible shell, right? That flexible, we're talking about the flexible carapace. It allows it to balloon up almost like a cartoon character. They get super duper duper fat when they're in Canadian waters. And they really don't feed again until they get down to the nesting beach. I love this photo, even though it's a little bit blurry, because the skull prevents the turtles from being fat. Like you can't get a lot of fat around your skull, but boy, as soon as the neck is available, it just is like as fat as a turtle can get. And so we get sea turtles from, as I was saying before, South and Central America, as well as far north as Florida, that come. We've been able to identify through tagging, so using flipper tags or microchips in the shoulders of leatherbacks, which is a marking practice that researchers do globally, or by doing the mDNA, the matrilineal DNA tests on leatherbacks. We've been able to identify 15 different countries that contribute leatherback sea turtles to the Atlantic Canadian jellyfish buffet, which is really important when we're thinking about how we protect animals in Canada and in Canadian waters, because we have, if something terrible happens to the leatherbacks of Puerto Rico, or as we've seen St. Croix, which used to have a good sized nesting population and now only has a handful of leatherbacks, that's impacting seriously that area of St. Croix. If we see a similar thing happen in Atlantic Canada, if suddenly we lose or do something that causes the loss of a huge proportion of the Atlantic Canadian population of leatherback sea turtles, we are impacting all the sea turtles of the Western Atlantic. It's a really big deal. It's a really big deal. Keeping them safe here is a really big deal. The greatest proportion of sea turtles that we see in Canadian waters comes from Trinidad. And so we do a lot of work, about 60% of them come from Trinidad. We do a lot of work in Trinidad specifically, because that's the place where most of Canada's turtles are coming from or going to. So if we want to have the biggest impact that we can have with the limits of budgets and so on, that's really a great place to put our efforts. And we have dear friends and colleagues that we've worked with for 25 years down there, which is great. But we also work with people in all these other countries as well. This is actually a Trinidad tag turtle that we're finding on our nesting beach. I know it because it starts with the letter T for Trinidad. Canadian flipper tags start with CAN for Canada. And it's a letter and some numbers, and then on the back an address, so we can all track each other's sea turtles over the ocean and get to know kind of what's going on with individual turtles and whether they're surviving, how long they're nesting, how many years they've been nesting for, and things like that. We tracked one of our sea turtles down to this beach in Colombia. Her name, the turtle we called, the funder who had helped sponsor her satellite tag, called her Red Rocket. And this is Red Rocket on a beach in Colombia. And is a really big deal for us when she got down there, because this is a community that had previously harvested all the sea turtles that came onto their beach, and were trading in illegal sea turtle parts. And the man that's in the middle of this picture, the older gentleman in the middle of the picture, had one day had this epiphany on a nest on the beach, the nesting beach in front of their community, and there had been 7 dead sea turtles just lying around in front of him, and he just had this moment where he decided that instead of killing the turtles, they should try and protect them. And he convinced his whole community to agree to do what he was saying they should do. There are about 250 people in that community, and convinced them to become protectors of sea turtles instead of harvesters of sea turtles, which is a really, really big deal. This is rural Colombia, an agrarian society, and it's really hard to tell people that you don't any longer want to help trade in parts of things. And it's hard to tell the communities around you that you think what they're doing is wrong. That's tricky. It takes a lot of bravery. The bravery that exists in the nesting beach world is incredible to me. People trying to change attitudes and behaviors that have existed for generations. They were really excited when Red Rocket came to their beach. They felt like it was a sign from God telling them they should continue to protect the sea turtles. They were really, really thrilled. So were we. This is this is Costa Rica. This is what a poached nesting female turtle looks like. People will poach leatherbacks for their eggs, as well as the eggs developing within the female, as well as for meat, and they'll also poach the eggs from the nest. If we're looking at other threats to sea turtles, this is a beach in Dominican Republic, just outside your resort. Garbage rolls in, same thing that we see in Trinidad. So much garbage. Our colleagues in Trinidad do a beach cleanup every year that will take like 2 tons of garbage, literally they weigh it, off of their nesting beach before the nesting season starts. And I've been on those beaches and watched things roll in that are incredible to me, like a television set, like a freezer, like a deep freezer, like crazy things get washed in. Not just water bottles and shampoo bottles and the things that we typically think about, flip-flops, that kind of stuff, all of those things as well, but just incredible types of garbage. And it makes it impossible for sea turtles to nest and hatchlings to emerge. It's a really big deal. This is plastic that was harvested from, or that was found inside a turtle that died. Plastic's obviously an issue that we all think about. It's an easy one to kind of grab onto, and some of the other issues that face leatherbacks are so complicated and intractable that plastic's an easy one for people to kind of focus on, and it is an issue for them. But it's not big plastic bags. A lot of times you'll see in advertising and things like that they'll show like a floating plastic bag coming along, and they'll talk about how turtles mistake them for jellyfish. And for sure you can see, I don't know if you recall one of the photos I showed earlier of the leatherback underwater and just kind of pieces of jellyfish around it. You can see why they would think plastic was jellyfish, if that's indeed what they're thinking. But the real issue for with ocean plastic is, of course, what ends up becoming a microplastic, right? Is that the UV causes the plastic to become the intense UV of the sun causes it to become brittle, and the wave action helps break it down, all the things that produce microplastics ultimately. So leatherbacks are often facing more just pieces of plastic, right? Not just a great big bag. And so that'll get lodged in that structure, right? The esophageal spine structure that I showed you pictures of earlier, and it'll get lodged inside there. And then you'll get one piece, and because it's an inorganic material, it won't break down, right? Jellyfish get lodged in there, and ultimately it breaks down. And so it'll be caught in the throat, and then it will attract kind of other things. If they swallow more, it all tends to get balled up in the same spot. And so this is how leatherback died in North Carolina. This is such a sad little story. This is a hard-shelled sea turtle that was found by a colleague, a friend of ours, Kathleen Martin in Florida. She is happens to be a sea turtle researcher. She was walking along the beach on a Saturday, basically, and saw this little post-hatchling turtle. So probably maybe a month old, struggling in the surf, where it should never have been. And she picked it up and brought it immediately. There's a sea turtle hospital close by. She brought it immediately to the sea turtle hospital to try and see if there's anything they could do to help the animal, and the animal died. And they found 898 pieces of plastic inside its gut. And that is just something no animal can come back from, right? Other issues for sea turtles. This is a Canadian sea turtle, again, identified through the markings, like flipper tags it had on a beach in St. Croix. And this is an oil refinery behind her. And so their oil refinery is trying to reinforce the shoreline around them. And so they're using these big pieces of concrete to do that. It, of course, makes the nesting beaches inaccessible for species like leatherbacks. And it means they do things like nest along the high tide lines, so their nests get washed out, for example. But it's something that they simply can't contend with. And when we talk about climate change, there are a number of issues for climate change, obviously for sea turtles. One of the most interesting ones is that the the sex of a leatherback turtle is determined by the temperature of its nest, as occurs in some other reptiles as well. And so it's, if you have a cooler, the cooler part of the nest, the idea is if you dig a deep hole, right, it's cooler at the bottom and warmer at the top. And so hypothetically, you get, a mix of male turtles at the bottom, kind of female and male in the middle, and then female turtles at the top. Well, when you have an increasingly warm earth, more of these nests are becoming increasingly feminized. You're getting some nests, particularly they're talking about this in Australia, where the entire nest is female turtles. And studies that have been done on some of the hard-shelled species, even in Florida, loggerheads, I believe, and they're finding these completely feminine nests are finding that they don't, the survival rate is fewer for nests that don't have a mix of male and female turtles in them for some reason. The other impact of climate change is that you get increasing storms, right? You get much more ravaging storms along those coastlines, which means the coastlines for people who are trying to inhabit them have to be reinforced, right? And this leads to issues for sea turtles as well. And then, of course, in Atlantic Canada and throughout the world, this is a turtle off the coast of Cape Breton. The biggest issue is entanglement and death in fishing gear. Leatherback sea turtles breathe air, and they need to be able to get to the surface of the water to breathe. And if they can't, they die. They can hold their breath, like I said, for about an hour, but they can't. The saddest part of the leatherback is if they roll in fishing gear and they get scared, leatherbacks roll, they get entangled, deeply entangled, and just the tide goes up, right? And they can't raise themselves above the tide line. So a lot of turtles we pull out of the water, that have died just by a couple of inches. And so there's fisheries that we worry about, obviously in the Canadian context, but also really serious fishery issues around the world. And so we've been studying those. This is with our colleagues in Trinidad. We try and share knowledge throughout all of the collaborations that we have. And this was doing satellite tracking practices with Trinidadian colleagues. And then this is the fishery in Trinidad. I was just there not even a week ago, I guess just a week ago. Anyway, and it's, they use effectively open, these are open boats with just an outboard motor on them, and they go and they fish, and they use a lot of gillnet fishing. And the gillnet's one of the fishers that I was speaking to. I mean, they're pulling out 8 turtles to 12 turtles a night out of this net. Now, not all the turtles are dying. They're really trying to help them, but enough of them are getting caught in gear. It's really dangerous. And this is work that you can see. This is kind of a track of where leatherback sea turtles go between nesting and how it mirrors sort of where there's some fishing in places like Trinidad. And this is an issue worldwide. So how do we combat that, right? What are we doing to try and manage, people taking leatherback turtles? No fisherman wants to entangle a turtle. It's no fun. It's not what anybody wants. No one's doing it on purpose. It's just, how do we manage to mitigate those threats is a question that we think about a lot, in addition to all these other threats. One of the ways we do that is through ecotourism. And that's what I just finished doing in Trinidad. I just came back. We have ecotours, so we run a couple of them every spring, where we bring people down to see Canadian sea turtles nesting in Trinidad, and to show the incredible culture of Trinidadian place and area, and our colleagues down there, and looking at how organizations like ours in Nova Scotia and theirs in Trinidad work internationally to try and solve these really big, complicated issues together, and to also help on the nesting beach and worldwide. One of the ways that you keep sea turtles safe, and it's established as sort of one of the ways we address the threats to them in terms, of poaching, is that you make the turtle more valuable alive than they are dead. So we make sure that people see that they get more economic spin-off from a sea turtle through an eco-tour than they ever do through just one tour through a poaching of it. So it's a good, it's a way that you bring money into the region using, people stay in a local guest house. We have everybody's eating food that's grown locally. This is a remote rural town that's really small. People are putting money into the corner stores and buying things that were made by craftspeople in the area. So it's ways of just constantly reminding people that leatherbacks have value to people internationally. And as well, through the ecotour, we go and help the nature seekers who work there study the leatherbacks that go on. They have a 14-kilometer stretch at beach, and we help with the measuring of the turtles, and sometimes the weighing of them, and satellite tagging, and just doing health checks on the turtles, which is really exciting for the volunteers to do. This is a little turtle on the nesting beach. They're so, so cute. And we get to see hatchling turtles and help them. Sometimes there's always a few stragglers in a nest that need to be have someone pull them out, because they would die typically, and that's normal and kind of natural. But we're trying to help get as many to the ocean as we can. It's such a hard go for any of them to become large in the first place. So we do help with the the stragglers from the nests and pulling them out. So people get to help with that. And then also just working with the turtles at night, which is really amazing. And you can see them working. This is a team working with a nesting female turtle. And also just getting to be friends with people, right? I mean, the main thing that we do when you're trying to deal with really big issues, right? Like people are harvesting leatherback turtles sometimes because they're hungry, and fair enough, right? How do you deal with issues where you're like, we have colleagues I always think of in Venezuela, and where we know that some of the Canadian turtles have been harvested. Well, people are just starving. Like, what do you have to allow people to eat, right? So how do you deal with these issues that are really complex, and how do you figure out how to manage fisheries that are quite different fisheries, and how do knowledge sharing? We've brought fishermen down to Trinidad before to help explain how Canadian fishermen help to keep sea turtles safe and how to try and transfer that information. Like, how do you deal with these issues in different cultures, with different languages, with different political structures and different degrees of political will? How do you manage that? Well, really the best way, I mean, we're really rooted in kind of peaceful approaches to conservation and peace building. And the biggest thing you can do is really learn to love each other, right? And learn to talk constructively amongst environmental groups, and to try and understand different approaches and try and understand the communities that are all involved in the different things that they need. And that's been a really big spin-off from the work that we do with our colleagues in Trinidad. And also Trinidadians come up and work with us on the field boats in Nova Scotia. They work with us at the Canadian Sea Turtle Center. And that might be a place that's of interest. I don't know how many people are looking for volunteer opportunities, but certainly if you're based in Halifax, the Halifax Sea Turtle Center is open now. And we do take volunteers to come help us teach the public about endangered sea turtles and the work that's being done to conserve them in Canada, and just the importance of them to the Canadian ecosystem, and that they're part of the Canadian ecosystem, part of it's sometimes tricky to get people to care about animals they can't hold, or can't see up close, or they don't find in zoos, it's so sometimes I feel like I'm trying to make them love my imaginary friend, I'm like, for real, they're real, but you can't really always bring them out. That's why we brought people to Trinidad, because you can see them on the nesting beach in ways that it's just really hard to find them in the ocean. So it's really important, I think, to talk to as many people as possible about these animals, so that in Canada, anywhere, you protect what you love, right? And so we want people to fall in love with these turtles, like we're in love with these turtles, to just try and help keep them safe. They're declining at a rate of 7.8% a year in the Western Atlantic. These are animals that are in steep decline. It's really stressful. There's a ticking clock here, and we need to make sure that we have as many people on side as possible. And there's really no time to lose. It's one of those things where I've seen a change in the number of turtles we see offshore in my lifetime. Often things happen when you're talking about endangered species. And certainly we've all seen this with global change, right? And climate change. We're witnessing things on this accelerated timeline it's unprecedented. And so it's really a thing to think about, what we're doing and how seriously we have to take what we're doing. So, we really appreciate volunteers to the Sea Turtle Center. And I will always say, if you do public outreach and education, it's as important as doing science on a field boat or on a nesting beach. You have no idea how you impact one person, and how that changes where they, how they understand their environment and what they're doing. And the other thing that I'll do, and I am wrapping up, is we do study hard-shelled sea turtles as well. And this is a loggerhead sea turtle. And one of the things that's another volunteer opportunity for people who are interested, and I think we can talk about this again in the fall, so I'll just do a little brief introduction, is we have a sea turtle beach patrol. What happens with these hard-shelled, these are juvenile hard-shelled sea turtles, kemps, ridley, green sea turtles, and loggerhead sea turtles, that they're teeny tiny. They're so sweet. Their carapaces would be about, sometimes 30 centimeters. Like, think of a school ruler in length. They're really small, and they get, their range is slowly pushing north again, we think because of the Gulf of Maine and how quickly it's warming. And you see these little animals. It's not that they weren't always in our waters, but that the waters, again, with rougher storms and all the other things that we're seeing occur, they find themselves in water that's too cold for them, and they become hypothermic, and then are no longer able to kind of swim. Obviously, they start to slow down, and they'll often wash up dead along the beach, or they'll be cold stunned, which means they're hypothermic but not yet dead. And so we're trying to find as many of these little turtles as we can. We had 16 of them that washed up this fall. It's usually November, December, January that we find them, and to try and find some alive. So we were asking people to walk stretches of beach around Atlantic Canada, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia particularly, although there is some tell of them in Newfoundland as well, looking for these little sea turtles to see if we can find them before they die. This is one that had died in near St. John, New Brunswick. And you can see they pull their little flippers in close to try and keep themselves warm, which of course, I mean, they're ectotherms, so they don't warm themselves up per se, but this one we just didn't find soon enough. But this is a really good story. This happened this year in Scotts Bay, Nova Scotia. People had been walking the beach and had found this turtle, which we called Scotty, still alive. And they picked her up and they gave us a call, and we were able to get her to veterinary care. This is Dr. Chris Harvey Clark, who was that original guy that said you should look at sea turtles, still at Dal and still helping us. And this is him looking at little Scotty. This is the day she was found. She was really lethargic. We brought her, he cared for her, he and his wife, who's also a veterinarian, really both tremendously skilled veterinarians, cared for her in their house until we could arrange transport for her.
When a turtle's got a purulent infection, you can smell it.
He's talking about how you could smell the infection.
It smells bad. She's got.
No, he said she did not have bad smelling breath. This is her a couple of days later. She was so lethargic at first, and then she kind of perked up a little bit, and we managed to get her to Bermuda, where she stayed for a couple of months, just kind of getting back up in shape. And they released her at Turtle Beach, and she swam off. So she was safely released back into the ocean, thanks to some of our beach patrollers, which is really cool. And that's all I have for you. Really, I'm happy to answer questions or talk more about sea turtles generally. And that's mostly my presentation. So
Thank you so much, Kathleen. That was really well done. I learned a lot. I feel like turtle conservation, with many other conservation projects, you're right, they're very complex, but it's really inspiring to hear what the Canadian Sea Turtle Network is doing.
thanks.
We do have a question in the chat from Norma Jean. Wonderful presentation, Kathleen. Can you tell me about your collaboration in Costa Rica? Norma says that she has worked on several conservation efforts there, leatherbacks and olive ridley.
So we've had turtles come from Costa Rica that we find in Canadian waters. So working, of course, most often with Tortuguero, but the Sea Turtle Caribbean Conservation Corps as well, we've worked with too. It depends on what beach the turtles are going to. So there's a lot of amazing work that's being done there through another group called Widecast, which we're also a part of, which is the Wider Caribbean Sea Turtle Conservation Alliance. And so we do work depending on which beach the turtle is going to and who's in charge of that beach. We'll get in touch with them if we have a sea turtle that's a Canadian turtle coming to them that we can see through our satellite tagged work, or when they find our turtles nesting on the beach, they'll give us a call and say, I saw, can 327 yesterday, and we'll look through our database and compare our databases and figure out what's been going on with that animal, which is always really thrilling. But yeah, they do get Canadian sea turtles there. And so we do work with them. We haven't done joint, so we do a lot of our satellite tagging work and things like that directly with Trinidad, because we know there's a much greater chance of actually having those Canadian animals come back just because there's so many of them. But we certainly do work with everybody in that region, right? So we'll get a satellite tag turtle. If we don't know where it's from originally, that turtle starts to come down into the Caribbean. And then Dr. Mike James, who works at DFO, who's really great in terms of keeping in touch with colleagues internationally, starts to keep everybody kind of in a loop about what's going on. And people will start to get ready to try and either take the satellite tag off that turtle or put another one on of their own, or things like that. So. Any other people that might have questions? I hope that answers that sufficiently, Norma Jean. Yep, there's a lot of turtle activity. I just see David Peters' question noting a lot of turtle activity around Sable Island. And oddly, the only incident that we have of a leatherback turtle that hauled up and then just hauled right back out at sea happened at Sable Island last year. They've never had leatherbacks on Sable Island. And we got a call from, I can't remember kind of the trajectory of it, because there end up being so many turtles over so many years. They had a photograph of a turtle that had hauled up on Sable Island, a leatherback turtle, as though about to nest, kind of looked around and then went right back into the ocean. And we have not ever heard of that before. It's one of the only times actually in the history of the last 25, almost 26 or 27 years of work, of a live leatherback turtle going onto up onto the beach and then being like, no, wrong place, and then just taking back off again. So it's one of my favorite stories about sea turtles. But yeah, we do get a lot of activity up and around that area.
I have a question. Um, is light pollution any sort of concern for
Yeah.
nesting sea turtles?
Yeah, it really is. And that's really interesting because we were just talking about this a lot in Trinidad. So leatherbacks respond to white light in that in a couple of ways. For hatchling sea turtles, when they're trying to return to the ocean, they head towards a white light. So I've seen hatchling turtles in nesting countries where they have like street lights, and I've seen hatchling turtles just go directly down the street and it becomes an issue. And nesting turtles will often become frightened and won't nest if they've got if they find a white light facing them. So they'll come onto the beach. If they see white lights, they'll turn right back around and they'll abort their nesting. And so it becomes a real issue for them in terms of nesting, making place nesting friendly for them, right? We want them laying those eggs and not reabsorbing them or depositing them somewhere else. So they typically you can only work with white light after a leatherback turtle goes into what we call a trance. So when she digs her nest, you can't have white lights around her. When she starts to finally lay her eggs, you're allowed to use white lights because nothing will stop them once they get into that trance of laying eggs. They'll continue to lay the eggs regardless once they stop. So you can get some photographs and things like that, or footage of them with the white lights. But for the most part, we do almost everything just with red lights because they're not bothered by red lights on the spectrum of light. And so, but we've seen too, you'll get all kinds of issues with it because the more developed areas, the beach that we work at in Trinidad is undeveloped. It's, in a very wild part of the world. And so it's not that having other lights isn't such a big deal, but there's some nesting beaches, even also in Trinidad. I'm thinking on the north coast of Trinidad where the nesting beach abuts a neighborhood. They've built right up to the edge of the beach. And so you're asking every household to have to make sure that they have red lights, and they have these beautiful hotels and they've got red lights all along the balconies and all along all the rooms. And then you'll see somebody will open the main door. And then of course the hallway lights are white, right? And so you've got this place that's trying so hard to do everything properly and have all the right lights and all the right directionality. And then someone opens the door and it just kind of ruins it, Anyway, it's tricky. I mean, there are some places, and certainly we run into this in Florida, where there's some really affluent areas, supremely affluent areas, where it can be hard to get people to want to change things. And we've had people fighting lighting ordinances, and saying we just don't want to have red lights around our homes. We'd like to have bright white lights, and we don't. It's inconvenient for us, So that's been an issue anyway. But directional lighting, so lighting that faces straight down, or also red lights, and you can see that when you go to Florida during the nesting season. If you're ever on the Atlantic coast of Florida when the sea turtles are nesting, you'll see a lot of those buildings and a lot of signs around saying that you have to have red lights only. So
Yeah.
will sea turtles nest in places that they've never nested before? That's a really interesting question. Not clear. So they tend to nest in regions, right? Like certain sea turtles obviously have a huge degree of nesting fidelity. So we would typically have a sense of where all those nesting beaches are. It's not necessarily that the leatherbacks are nesting in places where they've never nested before, as much as it is that humans just haven't been there to watch them, So, they're nesting in sometimes places that are really hard to get to. And are just kind of uninhabited areas of coastline, or places in countries where they don't have really active science programs looking at these animals and counting them and trying to, study them and census them. So it's, when we looked at studies of leatherback turtles and trying to, it's a very hard population to census for a number of reasons, but the difference between our understanding of population dynamics and population, like the dispersal of the leatherback population changed when suddenly people started doing dedicated work in West Africa, for example, and suddenly they're like, oh, there are actually sea turtles nesting here that we hadn't been counting. I mean, it's just people sort of starting to find the far reaches of places where indeed people are counting those animals. And it's tricky. It's tricky. And we think even of our own coastline, like when I think about our issues with Beach Patrol, and that program, which I love so much, but like it's a limited amount of space that we can access that's coastal in Nova Scotia, that you can walk along those beaches and get to. Sometimes we had a turtle wash up dead on a beach off of Digby that you can only access when the tide is low. You know what I mean? And so someone's like, the turtle's in there, I can get, and I was like, did you? And it was tagged, and So I was like, we need to find out which animal this is and try and collect it. And the guy was like, I got to wait for the tide to go out. And then I got to hike in 3 hours. And I was like, do you want to do it still? And to his credit, he did it. I was so grateful. But it's really hard, right? Coastal spaces aren't the easiest to keep track of necessarily, even in our very developed world, How well do turtles see? There have been a lot of tests that have been done on turtle vision and looking mostly at this light spectrum issue. We also could tell from that one of the things that we were able to identify through that work that we did with the critter cam on the back of the turtle, the studying, trying to understand the predator-prey relationship. We could see by the ways in which the turtles were swimming that they were visually finding their prey. So you could even see that in that video that I showed you where the turtle just kept munching and munching and munching before it grabbed that third jellyfish. They're visually finding their prey. And we can also see them silhouetting their prey against the top of the water. So they'll be diving down and then they'll come back up and we can see them silhouetting the jellyfish against the brightness of the top of the water. So they're definitely visual predators. They've also done olfactory studies like smell studies on leatherbacks and hearing studies on leatherbacks. But I don't have it's not kind of my area, so I don't know as much about those things, but they've certainly been done in the past. Is there any work being done to determine where the juvenile turtles are? Yeah, so they're just trying. So the big issue, it's really such an interesting question, right? Like, where are these little turtles? What's going on with this? And it's sort of this like holy grail of like, who's going to be the one that figures this out? And so there was the big issue that we run into is this evolutionary kind of loss on the leatherbacks part of not learning how to back up, right? I mean, the big thing that we can't do with leatherbacks, one of them is to put them in a tank and watch them grow, for example, right? So you can't keep a leatherback in an aquarium. It does not work 100% of the time. It doesn't work. And so the idea of, so actually the biggest study that was ever done on this, the most successful kind of hatchling growing study was done at the University of British Columbia, where my friend Chris Harvey Clark, this vet that's been so active with us, he had actually left Dalhousie, he's now back at Dal, but he went to become the head vet at the University of British Columbia for I don't know, I can't remember, a decade or something like that. He took a hiatus and went to Vancouver. And he was involved with a graduate student there, Todd Jones, who was interested in figuring out a way to kind of grow these hatchling leatherbacks to a larger size. And so he managed to keep them, I think they started with 30 or something, and they ended up with only one alive. And it was alive 28 months later before it died. So that was unprecedented, the ability to keep them alive. Because if you think about it, you've got these animals that dive really deeply. So it's really hard to manage that. And that if they can only swim forward, I mean, it's this beautiful thing about leatherbacks, right? They don't have a sense of walls. We know how to back up because we understand what a wall is, right? Like if you think about the evolution of it, they swim ceaselessly in the ocean. The prey that they swim also doesn't understand a wall, right? Jellyfish aren't like backing up when they see things. They're both kind of locked into this concept of a limitless, a boundaryless world, which is so beautiful. But it means that they don't, it's not helpful when we try and give them boundaries. Other sea turtles that are feeding on things like seagrass or finding fish amongst coral, for example, understand, well, if I get to the coral, I have to back up if I want to get that fish, right? They understand that type of relationship. Other sea turtles can back up. So it means that you can't keep them in an aquarium. And so what they had done in British Columbia is they had them kind of tethered to a bungee cord for as long as they could on these big giant tanks, and they had PVC pipes in the middle, so the turtle could kind of dive and do other things. But it's really hard to manage their diet properly. I mean, trying to mimic jellyfish is really tricky. And also we don't know what the little turtles eat, right? So it became really difficult. And no one's really been able to replicate that very well. So if you're looking at trying to satellite tag a little turtle, the hatchling turtles have proven to be too small to do that with successfully. The leatherbacks, because you can't glue anything to a leatherback shell. That's just, it doesn't happen. You can't do it with a larger leatherback. You can't do it with the babies, but you can do that with a hard-shelled sea turtle, right? You can glue something to those scutes. Often they'll shed the scutes ultimately, but it's far easier to satellite track them or to do that type of tagging. Just because of the physical structure of how a leatherback's shell is set up, it's almost impossible to do that. There is a study that's taking place, the University of Florida, or Florida Atlantic, I can't remember which of the universities anyway, where they're trying to grow the hatchlings a little bit bigger so they can attach a satellite to it to sort of see where they might be going. They've had a limited amount of success, partially too, we don't know how quickly leatherbacks grow, but it's possible that they're just growing and the thing is coming off of them, right, at such a rate. So it showed them leaving Florida and kind of of heading north, I think they said a little bit. So, but it's just still very, very early days. No, it's like, I think that was just really, I don't even think it's been released as an actual paper yet, just in the last year or two. So it's brand new and they're trying to figure it out, but it's just really hard to get them big enough and to keep them alive long enough to get them big enough to be able to attach anything to them. Yeah, it's quite fascinating. We don't really have any theories. They just disappear and then we see them again. In some ways, honestly, I think you guys stay safe. Like they've managed to be okay without us knowing. I don't know. Sometimes I think we make things worse. You never know. Any other questions? These are great ones. Well, certainly if people are interested in volunteering with the work that we do, or you're interested in taking a field trip to Trinidad, by all means, check out our website, which is just seaturtle.ca, or you're welcome to, we're online too at Canada Sea Turtle, or you're welcome to text me or email me directly. And I'm really, really happy to respond and to welcome anybody into any of those projects that we do. We love, we called it, I got to name the organization and I called it the network, Canadian Sea Turtle Network, on purpose, because I really loved that idea of understanding that we can't ever do anything just on our own and that you really need a huge group of people, a huge kind of safety net of people to help conserve these animals. And so we take that really seriously, and really appreciate what people bring to the work that we do. And you certainly don't have to have a science background. It's not required at all. It's really just an interest. And we really find, and we see this in our eco tour too, when people are down on our field trip to Trinidad, they show up with all kinds of different talents and hit backgrounds, and they bring things to the work that we couldn't have even known we needed, but because they showed up as themselves. And that's really what's important to us, is people just being who they are, and allowing us to kind of take advantage of all the gifts that you have to help sea turtles. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Kathleen.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was a great presentation.
Thank you. It's super fun to be here.
Yeah.
We'll bug all of you again about Beach Patrol in the fall.
Great.
Yeah, we would love that.
Yeah, we'll send you the video once it's finished and uploaded.
Thank you. That would be great.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Have a good evening.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Good night.